Welcome to our first session of the day, our first academic session of the day. My name is Amanda Richey, and I'm an associate professor of TESOL and literacy education here at KSU. And I forgot to say Assalamu alaikum, sabah al-khair. Welcome. It's still morning. We're very happy that you're here, and thank you, Dr. Scully, for starting a very important conversation that will continue over the next 2 days. So our first session topic is on education and agency in Morocco. We have 3 speakers that will present on this broad topic of education, issues of access, civic agency, and capacity building in Morocco. We'll have a second session after lunch that focuses more on language and language use. Each presentation will only last about 15 minutes, and so we're going to ask that you save all of your questions until the end, and hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes to take some questions for the presenters. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker today. Asmaa Benbaba is an instructor of Arabic language and culture to non-Arabic speakers at Auburn University in Alabama. She holds a master's degree in cultural studies, culture and identity. She is currently a Ph.D. candidate, which means she's very busy, in adult education, and her academic interests span several topics within cultural studies, including North African cinema, African diaspora, urban planning, and foreign language teaching. The title of her presentation is The Challenge of Urban-Rural Accessibility to Education Across Morocco. So please join me in welcoming Asmaa Benbaba.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Amanda. I'm gonna stand here because I want to be able to look at my slides. So, actually, this project is an ongoing project, and so far, this is what I could get for this very interesting gathering about Year of Morocco. Thank you for the initiative, Kennesaw State University. So, the project is entitled The Challenge of Urban-Rural Accessibility to Education Across Morocco. So when I came to the United States in 2008, my first master's degree from Auburn University was in urban planning. So it was spatial analysis, and this is actually impacting my work. So let's start with education in the past. I know that all Moroccans gonna know University of Al-Qarawiyyin, and at that time it was evolutionary and very inclusive to everybody, and it was a regional recruiter. So students, they were enrolled, like big number of students, they were enrolled, and it was a system by itself. And I am comparing this picture, look at the beautiful design in the city of Fez, with actually, it's a far-fetched image, a regular school, which sadly reflects what's going on in our education system. And as I go through this research, I am myself, as a contemporary Moroccan graduate from Morocco, like I finished at Des which is a master's degree in Morocco, so I'm a product of my system as well. Sadly, I'm comparing it to a regular school, and this is actually where the level that we reach, and what Dr. Scully talks about. I'm gonna quote her, identities formed or developed in failures and insufficiencies. I love this. So school is one setting of forming identities. The purpose of this study is to describe the experiences of K-12 teachers working under the Moroccan system in both rural and urban Morocco. So the method I'm using in this work is the narrative approach. I was actually fluctuating between narrative approach and ethnographic approach. So I end up with narrative approach because it describes the human experience of teachers, actually, because I was interviewing teachers. Also, the narrative approach for this work allows restorying, voice. It captures the essence of the human experience. So in order to generate data, can everyone hear me? Okay. In order to generate data, I have used semi-structured interviews that I designed myself, and I also used a purposeful sampling because being here in the US and not physically there was a little bit challenging. Also, I kept a diary of each encounter with the participants in order to know how the changes and that happens in the research. Okay, so back to geography. This is actually a GIS. If someone, yeah, this is a GIS map that I developed. It was really hard to find the data or shape files to develop, to just know the concentration of schools in Morocco, because I wanted to have a visual idea of how it looks like in terms of access. Where are the schools in Morocco? Okay, so as you see, so the black little flags, those are schools. I didn't define what kind of schools at this point. Why? Because the government doesn't release all the data, and it's hard to get the data. You need all sorts of permissions. So as you say here, in the center, so over here, there is a aggregation of schools in the center, a little bit in the north, and all on the coast. But the other areas have actually weak access to schools, which explains visually the lack of access in schools in Morocco. That's just to have a visual explanation of the situation of schools access in Morocco. Okay, so after collecting the interviews, transcribing them, putting the information together, putting the experiences of people all together, so some thematics emerge. And I put them in a narrative format. So I call this the disadvantaged teacher / learner, because a disadvantaged teacher will give a disadvantaged learner. So I call it, let's say, a tale of the Moroccan school. So the first subcategory that was repeatedly, like emerged repeatedly by the interviewed people, by the participants, was that rural Morocco is a forgotten word. Nobody cared about rural Morocco. And then the previous presentation talks about that the rural movement just started in the last 10 years, which explains that rural Morocco is a forgotten word. Second thing is the prevailing privatization of education in Morocco. So more private schools are taking place, which also means lack of access of public schools, or like a beginning of a change or a shift in the roles of public schools in Morocco. Third element is failure of reforms. So we will see, in 2 or 3 slides, we will explain the failure of Morocco, of reforms. The first element is lack of preschools in rural Morocco. So this, I didn't have any information about that. I have always thought that preschools are a bridge between home and let's say CE1 or first year in school, and there is no preschools in rural Morocco. Also, teacher training, so there are issues in teacher training. And a recent phenomenon, so it's everywhere in social media and also in written media, school violence. So with all the subcategories of school violence. Okay, so the first thing that I'm gonna talk about is the divide between the urban and rural Morocco. So one of the characteristics of this divide is by design, which is there are infrastructural barriers, which means transportation, roads, access to water, electricity, health, all you want. The second divide is urban sprawl, which is a phenomenon now in Morocco. The cities are expanding, growing like crocodiles, which is a phenomenon called urban sprawl. And sometimes schools are far away from residential areas. And of course, with the infrastructural barriers, some families cannot take their kids to school. This has impacted student enrollment, which means, and this is prevalent among kids who are the first victims of this inequality by design. Of course, in rural areas, there is a big dropout from schools. And now, more than ever in Morocco, there are urban dropouts for different reasons, not just urban sprawl, for urban poverty, reasons such as ignorance, lack of education, sometimes absence of preschools. Also, back to rural Morocco, there are issues of language barriers. For instance, some teachers are appointed to teach somewhere where they speak Amazigh dialect, and the teacher or instructor is an Arab. So communication issues arise in the class. And also another issue is mixed grade class teaching. So another communication issue. Let's talk about the reforms in the educational system, just briefly. So during the independence era, the colonizer is out, 1956. So the promise was access to education. So all the Moroccan families send their kids to school, and it stays like that for 20, 30 years, 50 years maybe. Okay, so the first and second reform happens in the 90s and the 2002. The idea is to include rural women, or let's say rural students, especially women, into because there is a big dropout in secondary education. So there were a lot of programs of implementing a new strategy and trying to support young kids to keep going to school because they drop out after primary school. What happened is in 1990s, 2002, which means Reform 1 and Reform 2, fails. In 2008, the World Bank did a report on Morocco. And then they submitted a report saying that all the reforms that happened over the years since the independence fails because there is no evaluation, there is no assessment. There is a big change actually from independence to now, but there is also a lot of problems, and Morocco is not meeting the vision of academic charter of 2030. So, which means it fails. Okay, so this section, I call it reconstruction, destruction, or restruction, deconstruction, because constructing, yes, okay. So let's go to other elements, which is increasing the number of private schools. There is no trust anymore in public schools, and lack of standardization and regulation within private sectors. Also, there is scarcity of preschools in rural Morocco, and limited attention is given to diversity, linguistic diversity, for those who speak Amazigh in Morocco. This is a picture from rural Morocco just to show schooling inequality by design. So it's in the middle of nowhere with no extracurricular activities for the little kids. This is a class that shows, this is real pictures sent to me, that shows mixed levels in one class, actually. And it's very sad because you see all age groups. Teacher training is another problem. So whenever there are reforms in Morocco, it's not well paired, assessed, with an adequate training for teachers. I couldn't, for instance, find information on how much, in terms of dollars, spending on teacher training. Okay, so school violence. Reading a lot about school violence and what also the interviews, the thematics emerging from the interviews from real people who were victims, some of them, especially women. I call that a butterfly effect. So, excuse me. So, there are many types of violence. So first is physical violence. We all know physical violence, and we have seen on the media a lot of cases of teachers being stabbed or something similar to that. There is verbal violence, which is very frequent, student to teachers or teachers to students. There is structural violence because there is no respect to the teacher figure. Virtual violence, which is cyberbullying or something similar to that. And also looking at the students, psychologically abused students, okay? So I call it butterfly effect. Some solutions that also emerge from the interviews. NGOs find their way in Morocco for a long time. So for instance, the latest visit of the British, what's their name? The couple to Education for All, the Henry and his wife. So Education for All is a British-funded foundation, and it's funded by the British. This helps rural women reach, let's say, baccalaureate or high school degree. Also, Fondation Zagora, mainly for preschool. They are doing a good job. Bike project, for instance, as a nice initiative in cities to solve the problem of, in rural Morocco, to solve problem of access to schools. Preschools are mostly run by people or community groups or NGOs. This is started happening in Morocco, and that's a good initiative. Boarding houses, it's been there, since I was in maybe primary school or something, maybe the 90s, and it's getting better and better. Also, some other solutions that the teachers suggest are structural curricular solutions, such as educating on human rights, or promoting the idea of equality in schools, extracurricular activities that go along with what is lived right now in Morocco. Also, the education emergency plan that was between 2009 and 2012, it stops actually because there is no continuing finding. This is something that I like actually. It's called the ladder of citizen participation. So this lady, Arnstein, she talks about a ladder that has 8 components: manipulation, therapy, which means there is no participation between citizens, Moroccans in this case, and issues like education, for instance. The second, the third, and the fourth, and the fifth are placation, consultation, and informing, which means that those who hold the power are still not those who need change in the education system. So this ladder actually shows who holds the power, who wields the power. So unless people reach delegated power or partnership or citizen control, there will be no communication. Thank you. And questions, observations, and comments, maybe we'll leave it till the end. Thank you.